I'm Salvatore Bobonis, and I'm lecturing today on Indigenous-focused social policy in Australia. The image you see on the left is a promotional poster from the 1967 Australian constitutional referendum that resulted in two changes to the Australian Constitution. First, it gave the Commonwealth government the authority to legislate on matters specifically pertaining to Aboriginal people, a power that it had not previously had. Previously, that power rested with the states. Second, it changed the formula for apportioning seats in the House of Representatives so that Indigenous people living in remote areas would be included in the calculation for the number of representatives in Parliament. Until 1967, Aboriginal affairs were a state power only. At the time of Federation, the Australian Constitution gave Parliament the power to make laws with respect to, and this is a quote from the original 1901 Constitution, the people of any race other than the Aboriginal race in any state for whom it is deemed necessary to make special laws. Now, that odd term, people of any race, was in effect code for Chinese and Polynesian immigrants in Australia. Both mainly came to Australia for work, and the Constitution gave the Commonwealth government the ability to legislate on issues relating to Chinese and Polynesian workers, mostly temporary workers, in Australia. In 1967, the language was changed to the power to make laws with respect to, quote, the people of any race for whom it is deemed necessary to make special laws. In other words, the Commonwealth obtained a race power. This change effectively federalized Indigenous social policy in Australia. Prior to 1967, all Aboriginal policy was state policy, except in the Northern Territory and in the Australian Capital Territory, where the territory governments were under national control. In the rest of the states of Australia, Indigenous policy and responsibility for Indigenous welfare rested entirely with state governments. And indeed today, much spending, indeed the majority of spending on Indigenous welfare, is made by state governments, not by the national government in Canberra. Know that the idea that Indigenous or Aboriginal people were, quote-unquote, not counted before 1967 is a simple misunderstanding. This has entered the Australian lexicon such that everyone believes that there was literally no counting of Aboriginal Australians in the census until 1967 because the provision of the 1901 Constitution said that Aboriginal people should not be counted. That not be counted meant not be counted in determining the population of states for the purpose of apportioning seats in the House of Representatives. As you can see, Australian Aboriginal people are here counted in the 1933 census, 1947, 1954, 1961, 1966. This is a table from the 1966 census. In fact, Aboriginal people have always been counted in Australia. The language here, and excuse the outdated language, was that quote-unquote full-blood Aborigines, by which they mean Aboriginal people living outside of the Western or British political community in Australia, were being enumerated, that is, they're being counted, but they were not included in that calculation of seats for Parliament. Now, that in itself may seem some sort of evil, and in fact it was. But, of course, at the time, Aboriginal people, and certainly at the time of settlement, Aboriginal people in remote areas were not part of the political community, and their exact numbers were unknown. In fact, at the time of Federation, Western Australia and Queensland attempted to inflate their Indigenous population estimates in order to get more seats in Parliament, yet they were not providing services to people in those remote areas, and they were not allowing people in those remote areas to vote. And so this constitutional section was added to, in fact, to encourage Western Australia and Queensland to stop discriminating against Indigenous Australians. So it's a great irony that Section 127 has come down in history as an evil anti-Indigenous racist section of the Constitution, when in fact it was there as a progressive section of the Constitution to stop racism in Queensland and Western Australia, where Queensland and Western Australia were not allowing Indigenous people to be part of the political community, yet they wanted credit, so to speak, for Indigenous people in their representation in Parliament. In the other states, particularly in New South Wales, Victoria, and South Australia, all Indigenous people were quote-unquote counted, and all had voting rights as of 1901. Although participation in voting was extremely low, they were considered citizens of the state and had the right to vote in those states. In that 1967 referendum, there was a strong emphasis on Aboriginal self-determination. 5 years later, the Prime Minister, William McMahon, wrote in his summary of changes since 1967 that the government has a balanced strategy directed at essential programs facing many persons of Aboriginal descent who require a program of action worked out in collaboration with the states. That program, the 4-point program, was first point right from the beginning. This is the 1967 to 72 period, to encourage and strengthen their capacity increasingly to manage their own affairs. Now, not their own affairs just as individuals, but also as groups and as communities at the local level. So this is not sovereignty, but this is self-determination, the idea that Aboriginal people should have control over Aboriginal policy, or at least in implementation in remote and very remote areas. This idea is not something new that we've just discovered in the 2020s. This is something that goes right back to the beginnings of Indigenous policy, of federal level Indigenous policy in Australia 60 years ago. Of course, policy also wanted to increase economic independence of Indigenous or Aboriginal people, reduce existing social and other handicaps facing them in what areas? Health, housing, education, and vocational training. Well, those are still the focus today. And of course, promote non-discrimination. We often learn that the Racial Discrimination Act was the beginning of Australia fighting racial discrimination. The Racial Discrimination Act was just the final statement of Australia's battle against racial discrimination. The battle against racial discrimination and the broad agreement in Australia in the political class. Remember, McMahon was a Liberal Party Prime Minister. The broad agreement was that racial discrimination was a bad thing. And this was something that was agreed on by all parties as early as the 1960s. Now, if people in the 1960s and early 70s were more progressive than we might think now, we might also reflect that we haven't gone very far beyond what was already being done in the late 60s and early 70s to improve the living situation of Indigenous people in regional and remote and very remote Australia. A quick note, I keep saying Indigenous when I mean technically Aboriginal, because Torres Strait Islander people really don't fall under this set of policies and don't fall under the 1967 constitutional referendum, which was specifically about Aboriginal, not about Indigenous people. So I apologize for the slip in language that keeps occurring. In that first 5 years of federalized Aboriginal affairs, the Commonwealth government, it set up a training scheme to train and employ Aboriginal workers. It set up a fund to offer loans for Aboriginal businesses. It set up a hostel fund so that Aboriginal children could attend schools and universities in town and have somewhere to live. And it funded legal aid and medical aid non-governmental organizations. In 1971, the annual budget for Aboriginal affairs was $44 million. Now, this is the Commonwealth budget specifically for Aboriginal affairs, or about 0.5% of the Commonwealth budget. Now, when I say specifically for Aboriginal affairs, I'm not including things like providing education to Aboriginal children, providing, when Medicare was set up, didn't exist at this time yet, but providing health services. That is to say, this is special Aboriginal programs. We're 0.5% of the Commonwealth budget back in 1971. Well, if I contrast that today, we have the same programs. There is a remote jobs and economic development program to fund up to 6,000 Aboriginal jobs. There's a hostel fund. NGOs provide legal aid and medical aid. There are a small amount of money is spent in addition on providing grocery stores and a Torres Strait Islander precinct in Canberra. But that, other than this final thing, the small amounts of money spent on grocery stores and a Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander precinct, the federal government in Australia is not really doing anything differently or anything more today than it was all the way back in 1972. I even mentioned there was a capital fund for Aboriginal businesses. Today, instead of a capital fund, there is procurement that goes to Aboriginal businesses. The government is spending even less specifically to support Aboriginal businesses. It's just redirecting procurement. As a result, in 2027, the annual budget for Aboriginal Affairs is proposed to be $240 million, or 0.03% of the total Commonwealth budget. In other words, we've gone backward from 0.5% in 1971, where there was a real focus on Aboriginal affairs in the budget, to it being a tiny, tiny component of the Australian government budget. Now, much more money is spent on Indigenous social services, but it is spent on services that are generally available to all Australians. So when the Commonwealth or the states provide housing assistance in Aboriginal areas, that's no different from providing housing assistance in Sydney or Melbourne. When it provides Medicare services or NDIS, National Disability Insurance Scheme services, again, that's no different from providing those in Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane or Perth. Centrelink benefits like job seeker and age pensions are, of course, available to Aboriginal people in Australia on the same terms that they're available to non-Aboriginal people in Australia, regardless of whether they live in metropolitan areas or remote areas. Now, these services are much more expensive to deliver in remote areas. So when you look at the costs of providing these services to Aboriginal people living in remote and very remote areas, the costs can seem very high. But they're not fundamentally different from the welfare state provisions provided to non-Indigenous people. They're the same services, just being provided at much higher cost because they're being provided in very remote areas. In the same way, it costs more to provide services in central Sydney than it does to provide services in the inner suburbs or outer suburbs of Sydney because costs are higher in the center. In the same way, costs are higher in remote areas. Different reasons, but same elevation in costs. Now, in 2017, the Productivity Commission estimated the costs of providing social services to Indigenous Australians. And you can see that the costs on average were twice as high, $44,000 or $45,000 per person spent on Indigenous social services versus $22,500 per person spent on non-Indigenous social services. So the government is indeed spending twice as much on Indigenous people. But it's spending twice as much, again, because of two factors. The costs are higher. That accounts for about 1/3 of the difference. And the needs are greater. It accounts for about 2/3 of the difference. So, for example, many more Indigenous people as a percent of the population are unemployed than are people who are non-Indigenous. Well, if a large number of people are unemployed, then on average, people are receiving higher levels of JobKeeper benefits. Indigenous people in Australia have 8 to 9 years lower life expectancy than non-Indigenous people. Well, that lower life expectancy comes with a lot of costs, that is, costs of disease. The reason that the life expectancy is low is because of a high burden of disease. That high burden of disease is, of course, expensive to treat. So the reasons for these higher costs are not specific Indigenous-focused policies, but instead are the higher costs of provision and higher utilization of services in Indigenous communities, and especially in remote and very remote areas. If you look at the breakdown in costs, you'll see that although the costs in general are 2 times as high, the big difference in how that money is spent is in public safety and education. Indigenous areas are very expensive to police. very expensive to maintain community services. It's, again, a very remote area. When you fly people in and out of remote areas, that's much more expensive than people simply commuting to work. So a police officer having to fly to a remote area is much more expensive than a police officer getting up in the morning and taking the train to work in Sydney. Similarly, there's a greater focus on spending on education in remote and rural areas. Now, where there's less spending as a proportion of total spending for Indigenous people is the big ones are, and I should have circled these, economic participation, meaning that there is less spent as a proportion of total spending on engaging people in the workforce. And a big part of that is Centrelink payments, things like job seeker. And the reason is that job seeker benefits are the same, whether you're in a remote area or not in a remote area, you're getting the same job seeker benefit. So out of this bigger pie, less money is spent on employment, and general government services, less is spent as a proportion of the pie. Again, because providing the service is something that's done for everybody at a similar rate. Okay. The report breaks down expenses, also breaks down expenses according to whether they are mainstream costs or Indigenous specific programs. Now, an Indigenous specific program is something like an Aboriginal health program, or an intervention program for healthy children, or a preschool program for Aboriginal children. And you can see here that overall, the costs of providing services to Indigenous Australians, about 18% of them are Indigenous specific. And that varies by area. In education, about a quarter; in health, about a quarter; transportation and housing, about a third of the costs are Indigenous specific. But look at this. In employment services, less than 2% of the costs are Indigenous specific. And that's because the only employment services being provided in most cases are Centrelink benefits for job seeker. There's a small amount of provision of Indigenous job postings in remote areas, but that's extremely cheap and, again, not providing a lot of jobs or training. Okay, on top of that, these Indigenous-specific costs, although they're for named Indigenous programs, are not fundamentally different from the kind of costs that are experienced in non-remote or non-Indigenous areas. So, for example, if there is an Indigenous maternal health program, well, that's a named program that will get caught here in the Indigenous specific category. Yet it's really just diverting mothers from Medicare. That is, maternal health services are available in Medicare. If you name a program an Aboriginal program, it gets caught here as an Aboriginal or Indigenous specific cost. But it's really just a way of targeting services that are being provided anyway. It's a practical response to the realities that in remote and very remote Australia, there are large concentrations of Indigenous-only populations where it makes sense to serve that population specifically and not simply have, say, a primary care physician's office that would serve anybody. Everybody in the community is Indigenous. It is just as well served as a specifically Indigenous primary care center. Okay. All told, the Productivity Commission estimated that governments, and this is governments, both the Commonwealth government and the state and territory governments, spent about $6 billion on Indigenous-specific services in 2015-2016. That's about $8,000 per Indigenous person, and the split was 44% Commonwealth, 56% state and territory. So as I said, states and territories still play a large role in Indigenous welfare in Australia, the majority role, in fact. Now, to put that $6 billion figure in perspective, it accounted for approximately 1% of all government spending at all levels in 2015-2016. So on the one hand, $6 billion is a lot of money, and it is a lot per person. On the other hand, in the scope of government expenditure, it's actually quite small. The Commonwealth portion was an even smaller proportion of the national budget. So this is all government spending at all levels. The Commonwealth spends more than the states as a whole, and the Commonwealth is spending less on Indigenous welfare. Now, again, I want to stress, this is not spending on Indigenous advancement. This is spending that is targeted welfare services that are the same welfare services that are available to non-Indigenous Australians, but the targeted programs to serve Indigenous Australians. So even this figure is relatively small. In fact, more than half of Indigenous specific spending simply went into children and health. So early childhood development, a quarter; healthy lives, which is essentially was health, 24%. And then if you were to add in some of the spending on other government services and safe communities is also child related. More than half of the spending is going on children's education and health. Now, these are areas that the state, more broadly, that is state and Commonwealth governments, are already responsible for. And again, I want to stress, if there is an Indigenous specific program to target something like maternal health, that's simply aggregating together a series of programs that non-Indigenous people would have access to if they weren't Indigenous. That is, there's very little in the way of special services that are specific to Indigenous people. Okay. I want to stress here, almost nothing, $100 million, which in the scope of Australian government budgets is a minuscule amount. $100 million was spent on economic development. Okay. Today, the government's flagship remote jobs and economic development program is budgeted at just $60 million a year for 5 years. It's hoped that this program will deliver up to 6,000 community service jobs. Now, that is a substantial number. For context, roughly 27,000 Indigenous people are currently employed in remote areas, so 6,000 additional jobs would boost employment. That is under the assumption that these are additional jobs, that the currently employed people would not take all of these jobs. There's a good reason to believe that many of the currently employed people would simply be shifted into these jobs. But leaving that aside, a boost in employment would be welcome. That said, the proportion of adults not in the labor market in remote and very remote areas among Aboriginal people is roughly twice the level in metropolitan areas. That is, it's roughly around 60% versus 30% for metropolitan areas. In metropolitan areas, 30% of adults are not in the labor market because they are raising children or too ill or disabled or in schooling. In Indigenous, remote and very remote Indigenous populations, the figure is closer to 60%, so it's about twice as high. Indigenous procurement targets are the second major area focused on economic development. Redirected $771 million to Indigenous-owned businesses, but less than 10% of this went to remote areas. So again, if we're talking about remote and very remote Indigenous economic development, total is around $60 million from the RJED and around $70 million from procurement, or about $130 million a year, which again, in the context of the Australian government budgets, is a very small amount of money. Now, crucially, Indigenous-owned businesses don't have to hire Indigenous people in order to deliver those services. The requirement is that businesses, to be eligible as Indigenous-owned businesses, have to be 51% Indigenous-owned, but they only have to have 3% Indigenous employees, and of their outside contractors, 4% of their outside contractors have to be Indigenous. In other words, Indigenous-owned businesses, to qualify for Indigenous procurement programs, only have to employ roughly the same percent of Indigenous people as the proportion of Indigenous people in the Australian population. So although there are a small number of wealthy, or not necessarily wealthy, but a small number of, let's say, successful Aboriginal business owners who benefit from government procurement, there's not a lot of Indigenous employment coming out of government procurement. In short, economic development programs to support employment in remote and regional Aboriginal communities are poorly funded, It's not a lot of money, maybe around $130 million a year, and very badly targeted in that they don't necessarily promote additional employment in those areas when the crying need is for employment. In short, the Australian government has done relatively little with its 1967 constitutional powers. Indigenous-specific education, health, housing, and public safety programs merely address the concentrated needs of an identifiable population in need. They, in fact, only make use of the 1967 powers by having a quote-unquote Indigenous focus instead of a quote-unquote remote and poor focus. Even without the 1967 constitutional amendment, the Commonwealth government could do exactly what it's doing today, only instead of calling that service center that offers maternal health services in Alice Springs, instead of calling it an Aboriginal health service, if it simply called it a remote health service, that would have been within the government's constitutional powers before 1967. Spending on Indigenous-focused transformative economic development initiatives is virtually non-existent, and that's what was really needed from 1967. What was needed was a power for the Australian government to go into areas that had historically been under state administration and offer nationally funded economic development initiatives for those areas. In general, economic development is a state responsibility. The 1967 powers would have allowed the Commonwealth to undertake Aboriginal-focused economic development initiatives. It has done very little in that regard. When we look at exactly what it's done, pretty much it's done remote jobs and economic development and procurement targets, and that's about it. In my view, the rhetoric of self-determination is mostly used as a shield for government inaction. That is, by saying that Aboriginal people will have control over government spending, the government walks away from its responsibilities. So, for example, by creating an Aboriginal housing authority that is mostly run by Aboriginal, or where services are delivered by Aboriginal-led NGOs, the government abnegates responsibility for providing housing to the same standard that it would provide it in an urban area, because it says, well, that's self-determination. On the other hand, the government has not funded the tools that would be necessary for any meaningful self-determination for Aboriginal people in remote and very remote areas. A more effective approach might focus on employment, especially employment in mainstream businesses and government organizations that could change community norms around employment and employability, that people would expect to have jobs and people would be expected to have jobs. Jobs that are practical, applied, where people are doing something other than community service, cleaning up garbage from their own communities. Well, there's something wrong with cleaning up garbage, but that's not the same as operating a trucking service, or operating, a solar panel installation service that are actual businesses. Okay. Having Indigenous business development in remote and very remote areas would create a nucleus of employed people who could support a larger community. The current focus on Indigenous-owned and Indigenous-run organizations tends to create what you might call an Indigenous bourgeoisie, that is, an Indigenous ownership class, without improving the lives of ordinary people. There's nothing wrong with having an Indigenous bourgeoisie, but if that Indigenous bourgeoisie is not employing Indigenous workers, well, not much is being accomplished for the community as a whole. Instead, that Indigenous bourgeoisie is co-opted into, ultimately, white majority administered programs and is bought out, so to speak. That is, it is prevented from serving as the nucleus of a sovereign or semi-sovereign indigenous community because it is so closely tied into white-controlled bureaucracies. True self-determination means political control over community governance, not simply giving individual Indigenous people control over the distribution of resources. Today, the Australian government can point to an organization and say, well, it's Indigenous run, therefore, don't blame us for the poor social outcomes. It's being Indigenous run and Indigenous people are responsible. A true self-determination would mean that even if the services are being offered by white people, even if a housing program for Indigenous clients is being run by not particularly Indigenous people, the Indigenous clients have the oversight of that. The same way that, in local government in Australia, no matter who's working for that government and what race they may be, oversight rests in the community, who can always replace the leaders at the ballot box. Research on international development generally points in this direction. The most transformative investments a government can make are in infrastructure. If you want to see development and community development in remote areas, you have to pave roads, all-weather roads, create airports, again, all-weather airports, not a dirt strip in a remote area, but actual paved tarmac airports. And you have to have secure water and electricity supplies. Many remote Aboriginal communities do not have regular running water and have only intermittent electricity due to delays in the delivery of diesel fuel. Now, why is diesel fuel delayed for delivery to the microgrid, the diesel microgrid? Because of a lack of all-weather roads. That is, infrastructure development is a package. Build roads, build airports, build water supply, and provide electricity all in one package. If governments were to make that intervention, they could dramatically improve lives in Indigenous communities by supporting the development of communities and businesses. Very few businesses want to operate in a place where there are only dirt roads, where they can't be certain they can get supplies in, where the electricity supply comes on and off and you have to provide your own generator. These foundations for economic development work in remote areas in developing countries. There's no reason to expect they wouldn't work in remote areas in a developed country in Australia. If anything, they should work much better in a developed country like Australia, which has much more resources to pour into these kinds of infrastructure. Vulnerable remote communities are not the places to experiment with faddish solutions. Now, we see lots of these. For example, that homes in remote Indigenous communities should be built out of clay because then they are in tune with the environment. They don't look ugly, and they have natural air conditioning, reducing the stress on electricity and what the consumption needed to support modern life. Well, I have news for you. You can build a mud home in Sydney. You don't just have to do it in Indigenous areas. Why don't people build them in Sydney? Because people much prefer to have electricity and air conditioning than to have a naturally air-conditioned clay house. And it's the same with clever ways to purify water, clever ways to provide intermittent electricity. They're all, if they're worth experimenting on, they're worth experimenting on in Sydney and Melbourne. Why do we tend to conduct these experiments in remote communities? Because remote communities do not have the level of community self-determination to demand that they have the same kinds of modern amenities that we take for granted in metropolitan areas. Finally, self-determination can only be realized in orderly communities that have local governments. Now, this can be promoted through education and language preservation, that is, creating a sense of community around the language, but also through local Indigenous control over town planning, the maintenance of infrastructure, housing, etc. Now, I stress Indigenous control. not necessarily Indigenous provision of services. Bringing businesses into these areas that can provide the skills and training and ultimately employ Indigenous people is crucially important. Those businesses, even if they're white-owned, can be overseen by Indigenous governments that are accountable at the ballot box to their local residents. Social policy can only deliver welfare. It can't deliver development. The key aspects of the welfare state are things like social insurance, the public provision of basic services, and anti-poverty programs. Indigenous Australia has all of that. I mean, all Australians have Medicare. All Australians have job seeker. All Australians have access to schools, to hospitals, to housing. And the same anti-poverty and taxation systems that apply in metropolitan Australia apply in remote Australia. None of this is different. What's different is the lack of development in remote and very remote Australia. Social policy can deliver benefits to individuals, families, and households, but this welfare state presupposes the existence of a functioning community within which these services can be delivered. Right now, Australia is delivering the services to, for the most part, fractured and non-functional communities. What's needed is the community infrastructure, both physical and social, within which people can build flourishing lives. For anyone who says that these areas are too remote, lack water, are impossible to settle, impossible to develop, all you have to do is look at places in the United States. And my favorite example is Phoenix, Arizona, a massive golf resort city built in the middle of one of the hottest deserts in the world. How is that possible? Very high levels of infrastructure spending to make Phoenix viable. Now, is that environmentally friendly? No, it's not environmentally friendly. But are Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane environmentally friendly? Absolutely not. If Indigenous people are not allowed, if they're not allowed to enjoy the benefits of modern civilization, if they are essentially forced to live on the land as a symbolic representation of nature, then we have come nowhere from colonial ideas that Indigenous people are simply part of the land and come with the land and don't have any rights of their own as individuals. Aboriginal Australians are Australians. Australians live in environments that are highly infrastructure intensive, and without that economic development, without that provision of infrastructure, there's no reason to expect remote and very remote Aboriginal people to enjoy the quality of life that we do in metropolitan Australia. The real unmet need is economic development. Thank you for listening, and if you'd like to hear more, I'm always thrilled to hear from students and the public alike at Salvatore Dapabonis at sydney.edu.au. Thank you.